Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, The Economics of Ocean-Based Aquaculture, Dollars and Cents on the High Seas, which is presented by Innovasea in association with IntraFish. There's no shortage of digital events these days, so we really are thrilled to have you here. My name is Aaron Kelly. I'm with IntraFish, and I'll be your moderator today. This event is being recorded, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. That said, you can submit a question at any time by typing your query in the questions section of your control panel. I'm joined today by Langley Gase, Senior Vice President of Innovasea. Previously, Langley served as President of Ocean Spar LLC, where he managed development of high-performance fish pens, operating equipment, and support services to leading offshore aquaculture companies. Also joined by Tyler Skladnik, a Senior Scientist at Innovasea, who leads the Geographic Information Systems Program. He also spearheads the company's research program, which aims to improve the efficiency and sustainability of open ocean aquaculture systems. And last but not least, we have Felipe Ramirez, who has served as Business Development Manager at Innovasea since 2017, with a focus on open ocean aquaculture. Prior to that, he spent more than a decade at DSM Dyneema, where he was involved in aquaculture, commercial fishing, and industrial applications. With all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get down to business and invite Felipe to start the day off for us. Felipe, it's all yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Sorry about that. Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. Glad you guys can make it. As Aaron said, I'm Felipe Ramirez, and I'll gonna go through briefly short introduction on Innovasea. We'll go through a little bit of open ocean aquaculture and the opportunities in the industry. We'll have a brief slide on economics of aquaculture and the shape that we'll have then into the roundtable discussion and hopefully some interesting questions in the question and answer session. So a little bit about Innovasea. So Innovasea is revolutionizing aquaculture by combining technological know-how with hands-on industry experience to deliver innovative end-to-end solution that maximize production. That is from whether it's from concept to harvest, whether it's on land or at sea. While our systems are precisionally engineered around each customer's unique siting, production, and monitoring needs, and all built to withstand the harshest environments, the outcomes of our work have been pretty uniform. Optimized species health, scaled up productions, stable equipment costs, and a partner who is invested in seeing the customer succeed. We have specialized in 3 key business areas: open ocean aquaculture, where we feel is the future of aquaculture and sustainable seafood production. And we've been at the forefront for more than a quarter century, designing, building cutting edge pens, technologies, and equipment that could stand up to Mother Nature. Our land-based aquaculture division is driving innovation by designing and building energy efficient, sustainable water treatment systems, and have been doing so for also over a quarter century, providing commercial fish farms, government hatcheries, universities, research institutes, zoos, and aquariums ideal growing conditions year-round, regardless of location. And last but not least, our aquaculture intelligence. We have sophisticated sensors and emergent technologies that help automate feeding and improve fish health, streamlining day-to-day operations to boost production and comply with the ever-changing regulations. We are 250 employees spread around the world in our eight offices. We have over 700 installations worldwide, including over 100 open ocean pens in 25 different countries, and are proud of our resume of having supported over 20 species raised in our systems. So why are we here? And the graph, you've seen this graph in probably a million different iterations, all talking to the increased production and demand coming from increased production and how aquaculture has now surpassed capture fisheries. The UN projects that this will continue over the next decades to meet the higher demand of the growing middle class. This topic is particularly relevant considering the large deficit of 50 to 100 million tons of seafood that is projected to be a gap over the next few decades. And we know that land-based and coastal aquaculture will, of course, be an important part of this filling the gap, but open ocean systems have the largest potential for capacity to fill the void of tens of millions of tons that are needed to scale up to meet the supply demands and continue to be competitively priced seafood products. Now that market and that demand, okay, sorry about that. Now a lot of the countries that show the greatest potential for fish farming are areas that are frequently with hurricanes, typhoons, and other coastlines exposed to the entire ocean's fetch. This is a major issue that has hampered the industry in development of these areas. And today, with the technology available today, we can utilize these environments. The satellite image is Hurricane Francis that passed over the Bahamas as a Category 4. A submerged sea station is located where the red dot is, stocked with cobia, and a couple of days after the hurricane passed, the farm actually was able to harvest. The potential of open ocean is massive, and in the graphic here, the red area is showing the top 20% potential for aquaculture, the blue being top 50% potential. So we call it open ocean aquaculture. It's been called high energy aquaculture, or simply fish farming in exposed sites. It's not so much to do with the distance, but more to do with the physical characteristics of their environment. In this video, you're seeing a submerged buoy being worked on by divers at 10-meter depth with 1-meter wave surface energies. And if you notice that the divers have issue staying with it. Imagine that energy. That energy is around, and strong currents and powerful waves are common in these areas. By removing the surface presence, as seen in the picture below, where you're actually seeing over 20 pens in the shot, farms are able to avoid most of the surface energy and provide quiet, healthy environments for strong fish to grow. Many of us are familiar with the economic structure and drivers of nearshore fish farming and recirculating systems. Open ocean farms share most of these characteristics, and we'll discuss some of the specific elements in this roundtable. 3 points that I want to bring out before we get started. Number one, economies of scale are much larger. The potential is much larger. This is a result of both an opportunity and necessity. Capital costs are often higher per pen volume basis, and operating costs may also be higher, but these can be countered by farmers keeping higher production levels and being able to keep a per kilo production cost comparable or even more competitive to other methods. There are also several decisions that a farmer must make as they prepare, and usually comes in a form of trade-off between capital cost and operational cost. As an example, the short and skinny is that in many of the areas where open ocean can take place, commercial hatcheries that are able to service their needs are quite limited. So a farm must decide if they're going to build a hatchery to supply fingerlings or outsource that fingerling production, which again is a trade-off between CapEx and OpEx. Another being the type of equipment, and as an example, using a brass mesh over more traditional netting, which the trade-off being the operational cost in reduced net cleaning and parasite treatments required. And risk is a cost that can be mitigated with confidence and reliability of equipment, staff, and procedures and feed. While operating in open ocean, many times physical presence is not always possible. So being able to maintain eyes and real-time information is valuable. There is no correct decision for overall. It's simply going to be a case-by-case decision by each farm. So with that, I would like to thank you for joining us, and yeah, looking forward to the round table and questions and answers.
Thank you, Felipe. And that's a great segue too. And I think that presentation was a great primer for today's panel. So at this point, I would like to invite the panelists to turn on their microphones and webcams. How you doing, guys?
Doing well, thank you. Good morning.
We're good, Aaron.
Great to have you. So let's unpack some of the points that Felipe went over during his presentation. And I'm going to start with a question for you, Langley. Where are we at today with open ocean aquaculture, and where are we going in the next maybe 5 to 10 years?
Great question. Thank you, Aaron. And thanks to IntraFish for helping us with this webinar today. So look, it's no secret, open ocean aquaculture is still quite small compared to sort of sheltered aquaculture. We're talking tens of thousands of tons versus hundreds of thousand tons or 1 million tons. You know, until recently, most of it's been in tropical areas or subtropical areas. You know, colder climates such as Norway are trialing large structures, but they're still at the nascent part of their development. It is growing everywhere. As I mentioned, it's faster in tropical areas. Why? Mostly because of the submersibility. You know, we see growth in areas prone to tropical storms, such as typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, that sort of thing. Traditional surface aquaculture is wiped out every few years. Felipe mentioned Eleuthera. Yeah, there was a farm at the north end of the island, Spanish Wells, that was completely wiped out. Hurricane Francis, but as mentioned, the submerged pen at the bottom end of the island was able to harvest a few days later. We see it elsewhere. We have a particular client in Jeju, Korea, the island on the south end of Korea. They're currently raising bluefin tuna. They get hit with a major typhoon every few years. It's a given. And those pens are still there 10 to 15 years later. In fact, this year, they had a horrible typhoon and they're still there, so no incident. You know, other areas contributing to growth in tropical areas, well, you know, there's less conflict with stakeholders. With submersibility, it's not only the advantages of storm, there's tourism, aesthetics. Hawaii and the Caribbean are a good example. There's a farm in Hawaii that's been there. I think it's been permitted since 2004. The only reason why that farm was able to start at that point is they brought a submersible solution to the table. The vibrant hotel tourism industry had an issue with surface pens, did not have an issue with submerged pens. And I guess sort of another advantage of sort of the tropics and why we see growth there, warmer water. You know, they yield faster growth rates. You know, salmon take 3 years, you know, roughly 1 year in freshwater, 2 years in saltwater to come to harvest. Warmer water fish, Seriola or yellowtail or hamachi or kampachi, for example, take anywhere from 12 to 18 months to harvest, depending on the water temperature. So you're basically generating more biomass in the same volume, you know, albeit those fish have some catching up to do in terms of FCR. We're not at that lean FCR rate that we see in more mature industries such as salmon and bass and bream. But to sort of close on the question, on a macroscopic geographical level, obviously the Caribbean, Central America, Southeast Asia, we're seeing a lot of interest there. The Mediterranean as well. There are storms there, and they are going further and further offshore. A lot of buzz coming out of the Middle East, particularly the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. The Middle East is looking to alternative sources of revenue as we move to cleaner energy, and they're also, like all countries, are looking at food security. So they want to be able to generate their own food. And then finally, as I mentioned, we are seeing some growth in cooler climates. We've got, as I mentioned, the client in Korea. We've got the interest in Japan, and as well as the Portuguese and Spanish Atlantic islands, just to name a few.
Interesting. And Felipe, I'm going to turn to you. Where are the investors and entrepreneurs in the space coming from, and what do you think they find interesting or attractive about the space?
Well, we really see two different profiles of investors. One are the people in the industry, companies in the industry already, seeing the writing on the wall and seeing fisheries decline, seeing the demand arise, and so they're looking to expand their operations into further and further out into more exposed areas. The other and very exciting profile are those entrepreneurs, those business people that also see that opportunity, see the 6-7% growth year over year in the industry, and are really coming in to find environmentally new and sustainable solutions to change the way we feed the world. So it's a combination of both, and there's really nice synergies that I think can come from that in the industry.
Tyler, just building on that, what's the most difficult part of attracting investments today? What are the biggest challenges if you're looking to line up that investment?
Every opportunity is unique, and people have succeeded and failed for a lot of different reasons. But a lot of the recurring trends that we see bases around there's a lot of uncertainty in the open ocean space. So there's a lot of novel production technology, new systems, new pens that people aren't familiar with. Likewise, there's a lot of new species. In more traditional aquaculture, people are very comfortable with salmon, shrimp, tilapia. They know the market, they know the revenue. And that's less true for snapper, grouper, cereola, where there is a strong market, but people aren't as familiar with it, and they may not be as comfortable with it when you're producing 2,000, 5,000 tons. And then the last big one is the regulatory environment is different, not necessarily for open ocean aquaculture, but for the areas where people are looking at doing open ocean aquaculture. And the United States is a perfect example where it's relatively exposed coastline, so people are looking at open ocean technologies. And it's just a complicated system that we have in the States with a lot of different agencies involved, and it can be time consuming and money consuming, and that can be discouraging. And there's other examples. We have clients in Latin America where the governments there may not have a framework. So it's possible, and we have clients who are engaging the governments there, but they have to start from square one in developing the regulatory framework. And again, that sort of dissuades investor confidence. So those are some of the reasons that I would point to that are sort of recurring within the open ocean space. And the last big one is that there's not as many success stories. So there definitely are a bunch of operating farms that are doing great, but there's not one for the particular region that you might be looking at or the particular species that you might be looking at. So it's a little bit different from investing in a new salmon farm where you can copy and paste and you can see what's been successful and you can just replicate that. It's very much new territory in a lot of ways for each farm. So again, people are doing great. It's harder to take that leap of faith because there are more uncertainties.
In terms of regulation here in the US and uncertainty, obviously we had a big election here in the States. Do you think now that that's getting sorted out, or depending on what side of the coin you're on, right? It's either sorted or still getting sorted, but either way, in terms of investor confidence, do you think that will build now that the elections are just about behind us?
I think absolutely. There's a couple reasons why we're optimistic. The first one is we get a lot of calls from US investors who want to do projects in US waters. So investor confidence is growing because we're getting the calls. The other one is the Aqua Act, which is a bipartisan, or has bipartisan support. And I think that will get reintroduced both in the House and the Senate. And there's been some turnover in the people supporting that, but because it does have bipartisan support, we're not as worried as that being changed the way we are with the executive order that Trump made, which was picking up steam and has some time limitations on it. So a lot of that work will get done. But because aquaculture, we see it as a win for everybody. And we're seeing that in the Senate, where there's both Republican, Democrat senators supporting it. We feel better about some of that legislature getting pushed through and giving people a more streamlined pathway to getting permits.
Gotcha. Felipe, in terms of dollars and cents, how much capital is required to start a farm?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, Aaron, because it all comes into the size, right, and to the scale that you're looking at. And also in the time frame that you're also looking to use an analogy that we use, to have that plane take off, right? How big is the plane, and how fast do you want it up in the air? So to start off in a smallish farm, 500 metric ton farm, you're looking at $7 to $10 million in capital requirements, and about $5 million in operating costs. Now that obviously has some balancing that you would have to be producing. You would start producing, and some of those operating costs would be offset by revenues. At 1,000 metric tons of production, you're looking around $15 to $20 million in capital. And I give a range again, going back to some of those trade-offs that a farm has to give. With about $10 million of operating costs per year, and a 2,000 metric ton farm, you're roughly in the $20 to $25 million of capital costs, with $15 million of operating costs per year.
Gotcha. Very interesting. And Langley, maybe this is a question for you. Where is that capital actually coming from? Well, what have you guys been seeing?
Yeah, good question. I'd probably say three main sources. Obviously, you have the traditional venture capital or private equity firms, not only looking to obviously generate a profit, build a business, but also impact investing, leaving a better place from where they started. We also see capital coming from sort of ongoing concerns, that want to expand into aquaculture. If they're already in aquaculture, into open ocean, if they're already in aquaculture, their landscape could be capped. There's only a certain amount of places in sheltered fjords, so they want to go into the open ocean. We're seeing that in Norway. Or it could be, an existing agribusiness that wants to get into aquaculture. We have a client that's in the feed and land-based, protein production, and just because where they are also looking into aquaculture. In fact, they've taken the plunge, and so that's another source of capital. And then I'd say finally, sort of subsidized startups, grants, loans, that sort of thing, but the kind of money that Felipe was just talking about, that makes it quite difficult. These are pretty aspirational, most of them end up sourcing outside capital a few years into it. We've seen it time and time again. I mean, this is a business of scale, it's you need to have a certain amount of revenue to support the vessels that go offshore, all the technology that's required for it. So it's quite difficult to rely just on organic growth to build a business.
Sure. And when you have conversations with capital providers and their affiliates, what are some of the biggest questions that arise when you're having those conversations? What are the first things they ask when you're fielding calls from these folks?
A couple of things, risk, and we're quite upfront with them. This is the ocean. You are dealing with a large monoculture. There's disease and so forth, but we meaning the industry have techniques to minimize that. Other questions really come out of a conversation. They approach us. They want to do a certain species. Stop, guys. Have you thought about what's your selling price? If you look at this model, any sort of farm model, that the biggest levers you can pull are the selling price of your product, feed prices. It's anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70% of your operating costs. We advise them. Do you have a good source of feed? So those are the basic questions. Obviously, return on investment. This does require patient capital. The large salmon conglomerates that are doing quite well now, were not making money 30, 40 years ago. In fact, they were, barely a glimmer in someone's eye. So it does require patient capital, but it is exciting. You're looking at an industry that's had, 6 to 7% growth year over year. So it is attractive to investors.
Building on that, Tyler, what really makes investing in the segment unique?
It's a very unique industry in a lot of ways. First and foremost, it's a very young industry, so it's kind of fun, certainly for people like me, but also for investors and farmers, to get in on the ground floor, to get to sort of dictate how you want to operate, and you're not locked into the way things are done. There's a ton of innovation going on, a lot of money going into R&D in the feeds and the equipment in a lot of different areas, which is exciting and gives us a lot of promise, but it does make it a unique industry to get into. The other point is, as Langley made, it does require very patient capital. I'd mentioned permitting can be a slow process, sometimes months, even a year or more. And then you have to source your equipment. There's a lead time on that. So it can be several months or a year before you even get fish in the water. And then it can take 10, 16, 18 months to grow them out before you receive your first amount of revenue. And so that's something that's important to understand. There's a lot of costs that go in there before you get any revenue at all.
Right.
And often there's a scaling up that has to happen before you get the returns that you sort of plan for in your business plan. So it does take a long time horizon, and people need to be cognizant of that. It's not a quick scheme. It's not the kind of thing where you can invest in and turn around quickly. You can't liquidate it easily. It's very unique in that regard. But I think a point that Langley made is important here. It is sort of provides this impact investor level of attraction that not a lot of other industries do. The potential benefit that you can have on the environment and on the communities that you operate in is really large and beneficial. And so that's what attracts a lot of people. So it's also unique in that regard, in that there is this this impact element to it. And we see that in a lot of the people that we talk to.
That's a great segue into my next question, which I think I'm going to direct to you, Langley. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the benefits and advantages of open ocean aquaculture in terms of an approach to fish farming?
Sure. So I'll put on my ocean engineer hat in terms of, rather than just purely the economics, but obviously from an engineering or biological point of view, you've got cleaner water for your stock. Potentially there's greater flushing. We've calculated in the past that every 90 seconds, give or take, you have completely new water in your pen without using any electricity. Tyler just mentioned it, there's less environmental impact, typically stronger currents, potentially deeper water. getting back more on the social or the economic side, there's bigger opportunity for growth in the open ocean. I mentioned, there's limited room for growth in sheltered waters, such as fjords and bays. That's why Norway is looking beyond their shores. Felipe showed you a slide in his opening presentation of the available areas. They far exceed what is needed to meet this protein demand. This FAO curve we all know of, 7 to 9 billion people. And then, Tyler touched on it, but and I mentioned it in an earlier question, stakeholder conflict, potentially faster, easier, and less costlier permitting. I said potentially. There's that social license. The closer your business is in someone's face, the bigger social license check you have to write. So, in summary, basically, it's a bit of engineering, a bit of biology, a bit of social licensing, and a bit of the market share versus market growth.
Gotcha. Tyler, building on something that Langley touched on, in terms of local communities and the financial impact on local communities, can you talk about that for a minute?
Absolutely. It's been a recurring theme. Felipe mentioned in the intro presentation, we're producing more seafood from aquaculture now than wild fisheries. So when you think about how important wild fisheries have been in defining these communities, coastal communities, aquaculture is now having a larger impact than that. And it's a little bit different because on a per kilogram production basis, aquaculture creates more jobs. Just the nature of the industry requires more people. So it sort of spreads those benefits out over a larger group. And then also in the communities, there's a lot of upstream and downstream industries that really get a lot of that benefit. There's the processors, the truck drivers, the ice makers, the seafood distributors. It really percolates through the entire community, and it's a massive boon to those areas. And those areas, in a lot of cases, are seeing a decline right now, either through regulation or just a decline in fish stocks, are struggling to produce enough volume to sustain all those livelihoods. So in a lot of cases, aquaculture can supplement the existing talent pool there and the infrastructure that's there, the processing plants, the boats. All of that can accommodate this increased production and utilize the infrastructure that's in place to improve their livelihoods and make those growing communities again, instead of communities that are stagnant or declining, or whatever is going on there. So it can really be a big shot in the arm for a lot of coastal communities.
Felipe, once a farm is actually up and running, what are some of the financial hurdles prospective operators should anticipate?
Yeah, avoiding global pandemics would be the first one.
Great advice.
But no, so coming back to something Langley had mentioned, right? You have three of the biggest drivers that a farm will see are the selling price of the fish, right? So being able to take that fish all the way through the harvest, all the way through the production cycle, right, through harvest to market, and being able to fetch a good price. The price of feed, that's an operational cost, and ultimately biomass produced. If any of those three go out of whack, you're going to have some headwinds. So definitely, price fluctuations in the market, being able to work with the species that you can anticipate the pricing on. Obviously, I joke around the global pandemic, but certainly as we look out, we see a lot of pent up supply that that is there, right? Not a lot of restaurants are operating at 100% capacity, so that effect on the pricing is going to be seen. But on the other side, working with species that are going to be inherently price fluctuative, like mahi, where you see that spike up and down, and trying to ride that roller coaster of pricing is not going to be a fun ride for the operator. feed and FCR costs. And so we work closely with our clients on being able to monitor feeding behavior, right, of the fish, but also of the operator, being able to use artificial intelligence to assist that feed operator to determine when the satiation point comes in, right? If you're going to feed your stock past satiation, you're losing feed that is ultimately never to be converted to biomass, and ultimately for an investor never able to be monetized in the market. And that biomass produced, the biomass produced, obviously that's a big one that sometimes is a bit of luck and a lot of science, right? So making sure you've got all the right biological procedures in place to avoid biological risk. But sometimes just bad luck is bad luck, and we've seen that trip more farms up than anything. So
you mentioned AI, and maybe I'll throw this out to the group. How is technology reshaping the sector, and where do you see technology kind of changing the sector in the years ahead?
There's a lot going on in a lot of different areas. You mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. That's an area that we're looking at a lot, and it's really about cost, supplementing a lot of the operational costs with things that machines can do cheaper, and often they can do it better and more consistently. So feeding is the big cost driver for a lot of operations, and that's one of the focuses that we're looking at in our R&D department. And there's a couple products that we're working on, and a lot of people are looking at this problem, getting accurate biomass estimation and developing tools to help the feed operator make the correct decision. So this is enabling him to make the right call on when to slow down feeding and when to stop feeding to minimize waste and get the highest FCR possible. And when you're talking about an operation that accounts for, like Langley said, 50 to 70% of your operating expenses, every minute point of or percentage of efficiency is dramatic. And we work closely with a lot of farms, and we talk to them about this, and they tell us a 1% improvement in FCR is worth $100,000 to us, easy. And so it justifies the cost of putting cameras in place, putting sensors in place, whatever you need to get the data streams to feed into these systems. And then it's just an algorithm, it's math, or we have these advanced, machine learning, take a video feed and recognize fish. Not my world, but we have people on staff who are doing that. And then it produces something that the operator can take as an actionable input, either an alert or we have a satiation index. It looks at the fish and it measures how fast they're swimming, where they're located, how dense they are in the feed ball, and it gives him a numerical readout. And then they as a farm can develop an SOP that builds on that. So it's more objective. The weekend guy, the skilled veteran, the new hire are all operating on the same basis, and those decisions are optimized for your farm.
Gotcha. I think we have time for one more question before we invite the audience to join in with the Q&A. And Tyler, originally I was going to ask you this question, but I think I might throw it out to the group. What advice would you give someone who's interested in open ocean aquaculture? I'll start with you, and if anybody else wants to chime in after Tyler, please do.
Sure. This is a topic that we talk about this all the time because we talk to people who want to get into the industry from a lot of different backgrounds. And we've worked with clients for a long time. We've seen where they've struggled, where they've succeeded. So we have a list that we go through with a lot of people, and it's really been helpful. The first one and the biggest one is to not go in undercapitalized. And it's not so much about the capital expenses. You can get a quote, you know what you need, you can lock that in. But operation costs and feed costs specifically are very big because, like I said earlier, you have to grow out your fish for at least one cycle before you get any revenue, and often a few cycles until you've broken even and are starting to see, you know, a return on your investment. So make sure you've planned it out and you're including both your capital costs and your feed costs, your OPEX, personnel, all that in your sort of cash flow schedule. And in the OPEX, there's a lot more uncertainty. So if you're operating in a new environment, and we've seen all kinds of different issues that, you know, you wouldn't think about. We have a farm that has a tiny little puffer fish that goes into the pen, and the fish, they just go for it. Any motion, they go and they eat it. And of course, puffer fish are toxic and they have mortality events. And this is something we worked with them, we worked through, we have a solution, but it's the exact kind of thing that, who would have thought of that? And so you have to have contingency, you have to have access to capital to overcome those unforeseen problems. Because like Langley says, you are operating in the open ocean, you're working with live animals, so you need to be able to account for that uncertainty and not have it screw your plans up.
Yeah, if I could add to that. Oops, sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, if I could add to that. Yeah, we got a little bit of a phase lag with Tyler there on the audio, so give it a little bit of leeway. Yeah, so Tyler mentioned capital. You know, we've talked about you know, what makes a good site, you know, further offshore, that sort of thing. So site selection is pretty important to someone coming into this industry. Obviously there's the environmental conditions, but you know, how close are you to infrastructure, you know, port facilities, buildings, road, power, utilities, that kind of thing. Tyler did mention species selection. Obviously, you don't want to go in with a species that might be great in that, you know, locale, but you spend all your potential profit on marketing dollars. That's important. Know the biology behind the fish. Make sure the brood stock, the hatchery science is there. You're not burning all those funds in the early years just trying to figure out how to generate fingerlings. Staffing and skilled people. I would say, you know, when someone approaches us and they want to start a project in open ocean, finding that mid to high level manager is very, very difficult.
Sure.
These sites tend to be in more remote locations. So we're not necessarily, you know, you're not setting up a farm next to a city with hospitals and schools and so forth. So, you know, that's something we also tell them to look out for. You know, we mentioned feed supply. If you're in the middle of nowhere and it costs you, you know, $1,800 a ton to get it there, and your competitor is getting it for $1,600 a ton,
Yeah.
regardless of your FCR, you're still behind. And you know, this is somewhat of a commodity industry. It's about managing costs. So really having a good, you know, feed supply is important. Tyler, I think also mentioned that, you know, fish health support, know what you're getting into. You don't want to be looking through for those of us on this, you know, webinar that are old enough to remember, go looking through the yellow pages for a fish vet. You've got to have that. And then finally, with the advent of AI and machine learning, we're getting more and more data. That just reinforces the practice of good data collection systems, processes. Even though you're in open ocean, you still have to subscribe to those biosecurity norms that you would in a hatchery or somewhere else.
And Felipe, maybe let's close out with you. We started with you. Let's give you the final word here. Any pearls of wisdom?
Pearls of wisdom. Listen, the opportunity is there globally. I think the appetite is there globally. Certainly, a growing middle class, a growing conscious middle class is certainly coming down as a trend. And so I think the opportunity is there. The technology is to a point never seen before in the history of aquaculture, and being able to use artificial intelligence as an example to really help and drive and boost results. So Yeah, I think it's an exciting time for the industry. Certainly is an exciting time for Innovasea, and so we look forward to what the years have to bring.
Well put, and I think that's a great place to stop now before we take the plunge into our Q&A session with the audience. Thank you so much, guys, for the insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Cool. So at this time, we are going to transition into that audience Q&A. If you haven't already, you can submit a question by plugging your query into the questions tab on your control panel. We're going to give everyone a minute to weigh in. And it looks like we already have quite a few questions coming through, and we're going to try to get to as many of these as we can. If we don't get to your question, we'll make sure that somebody from Innovasea reaches out to you with a response at some point in the days ahead. So let's see, let's kick things off. Can we talk a little bit about regional growth, where you expect to see more regional growth? I know all of you kind of touched on that at one point or the other, but maybe let's elaborate, regionally. And then we have a question specifically about where are China and India in terms of open ocean aquaculture, and where does the future look like there?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. Regional growth, I touched on it, I think, in an earlier question. Obviously, we are seeing excitement in the open ocean in Caribbean, Central America. But if you look at the markets, there's North America, USA, and Canada, and Europe. Those are sort of high-end markets, as well as the growing middle class in East Asia that Felipe touched on. So yeah, we are getting a lot of inquiries out of East Asia and Southeast Asia, and of course Central America and the Caribbean to supply potentially North America, and the Middle East as well, not only for feed security, but as we know, there are quite a few flights from those large hub cities into London, Paris, and so forth. And then I would say one of the more challenging areas that we are seeing some interest in is, believe it or not, Africa, Southern Africa, in that sense too, but albeit very, very small. But people are, there's two drivers. Well, there are a couple of drivers. One is low labor cost in some areas. That could be a driver for going to a location. Obviously, optimal oceanic conditions or access to infrastructure, but then access to markets. Southeast Asia. Not only does it have the growing middle class in China, but it's got those high-end markets, Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, and so forth. So people are, when we talk to folks in those areas, those are their markets. If you go a little further upstream, where the feed mill is going to go, they're going to follow where those markets are. You want to reduce that, not only that carbon footprint, but the dollar spent getting that feed, which is, as Tyler said, 50 to 60 to 70% of your operating cost. Reduce that footprint, and then also getting your product to market just that much sooner.
We have another regional question. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the interest that you're seeing in North America?
Fellas, one of you guys want to take that?
Yeah. And I would even say, you had mentioned China and India in the last question. We do get a lot of inquiries from China. I do a lot of the initial GIS work, the spatial planning. So we've done a couple of those in China. India, not so much that I'm aware of. It's an area that would be interesting to explore, but I don't think there's an actual inquiry that we've had from that area. Do you say the Americas or USA specifically?
North America, but I'm curious about USA specifically as well.
Yeah. So Canada has a very strong industry, mainly salmon in protected waters. And so a lot of those farms, like in Norway and Chile, are starting to look offshore, or I rather should say to more exposed environments. So they sort of go out of the bays and inlets and into environments that are more exposed to the wave action of the Atlantic and Pacific. So we're definitely getting inquiries from groups like that. In the United States, we have a client that we work with very closely in Hawaii, and we're now getting a lot of other interest, like I mentioned. Some doing salmonids in the Northeast, others doing more tropical or subtropical fish. in Southern California. There's a lot of activity in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. We're actually working with a group looking at co-siting open ocean aquaculture pens with reclaimed oil rigs. So once you have that infrastructure out there, you can utilize that as a base to store feed, to house employees, more boats. So it's an area that people have looked at a lot, but never in a lot of detail. And people are sort of exploring that again as they're feeling more comfortable with the regulatory environment. So in those areas, it's starting to move offshore. We're starting to look, beyond the protected waters. And then in Latin America and the Caribbean, that's been an area that we look at a lot. That's actually Felipe's bread and butter. Felipe, if you want to field that area.
Yeah, I want to come back to North America. We see also a lot of potential in the Northeast sector of the U.S., right? That's another area of interest that we're working with several partners. As far as the Caribbean, kind of going back to the map, and I understand my screen swap may have made that map much smaller. But the potential really is in the tropics, in open ocean aquaculture, or a big, large of that potential are in the tropics. And we see the Caribbean as really fertile ground for open ocean aquaculture. The proximity to markets, water quality, the wide selection of suitable species that can be grown, all have very good indicators for a big market to really be established. And then, on the last point, then really being food security. We've seen hurricanes increase in frequency and increase in strength, and communities ultimately wiped out and struggling for food security. We see the potential of, if you can imagine where you have fish farms out and you can drop them all below the hurricane as it blows through, you now have, and the pens survive and the fish are able to go, you now have the ability to monetize that production, right? Whether it's to feed your population or to raise funds for that support. So yeah, I think the Caribbean and Latin America certainly have huge potentials to make a real impact.
So to add to that, I think,
Sure.
Tyler, you and I were discussing the difference, and you're the biologist on the call here today. I think you were saying that in Panama, cobia sort of reaches market size, I think it was 11 months versus just a few degrees north in the Bahamas, where it's a little bit cooler, it takes 13 months. Did I get those numbers right?
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, there's a lot of variables that will play into that, but we do have data from a bunch of locations with cobia in the tropics, and you can see it. And of course, there's feed and stocking density, all that kind of stuff, but temperature drives a lot of that. And so when everybody's really excited about growth potential in Latin America, Caribbean, Southeast Asia, a lot of it is that you can just turn fish around much faster in warmer water.
Yeah, so
it's not atypical.
Oh, sorry,
Go
Tyler,
ahead, take it
we're
over.
dealing with
Take
the
it
time
over.
lag here. No,
Yeah.
go finish your point, and then I'll make my point. Sorry, we're dealing with a little bit of a phase lag here.
I was just going to say, people who are familiar with salmon are used to 12, if you're lucky, probably a 14 to 16 month grow out cycle. And it's not atypical to have a production cycle of 10, 12 months in a tropical area. And so when you talk about cycles per year and how much fish you're turning around per year, that's pretty dramatic. And you see that in the bottom line.
Yeah. So my point was, when earlier you asked, what advice would you give someone going into an open ocean site?
Sure.
The site location is critical. We just talked about 13 months versus 11 months. And so, imagine being able to grow the same fish and shave off 10, 15, 20% of the time. Obviously there's FCRs and so forth, but that's got to save you a significant amount of money just by going down a few degrees and targeting that sweet spot, or those sweet spots that Felipe mentioned.
We have another question here from the audience in relation to species. In terms of species, what trends are you guys seeing?
There's definitely a fair amount of of consolidation. Historically, it's been, salmon, shrimp, tilapia are the big ones. And then as we look at open ocean aquaculture, it wasn't really one obvious species, and we were getting, we were discussing a lot of different species with different clients, and that's still happening, but we're really focusing on maybe 5 different species groups. So snapper would be a big one, red snapper specifically, and that's actually 4 different species just in Central America. So it's really more about species groups, but that's one of the big ones. Cereola is another one. Again, that's a genus, and there's maybe 4 or 5 species that are produced within that genus. Grouper is a big one, definitely an emerging species that has a lot of market value. The production technology is still developing, but a lot of people are doing that on a commercial scale, especially in Asia right now. Pompano has been good. Sea bass has been good. A lot of clients are producing that successfully. So there's a bunch of them. Really, for a new farmer, when you're getting into it, people get really excited about an idea. Tuna is one we talk about a lot, and there is a lot of potential for tuna. We have a client doing tuna successfully, but there are some roadblocks. So I sort of break it down into 3 different areas. There's the marketability, the production potential, and the biology. And the market is really not what you can sell, but what you can sell for the right price at scale.
Right.
So in open ocean aquaculture, you have to go big scale, and you cannot expect to get premiums on your product. To have a boutique fish that you market well and you have a story, that works for certain projects, but it's not really a good model for open ocean, where you want to be producing 2,000 to 5,000 tons at a minimum. You need to be able to move that product, and you need to be able to move it at a price that will justify your investment. And that means certain species like tilapia are just not on the table. Tilapia is not good for open ocean for a lot of reasons, but the market, sort of excludes that already. So we look mainly at higher end species, pompano, snapper, grouper, like I mentioned, and that can come down to the mid-range species. Salmon, of course, is a good one that really from a market standpoint is a mid-range species. Barramundi is another one that has a lot of potential, sort of a mid-range market price that we think can be moved at large volumes. So that one gets a lot of attention. The production, like I said, a lot of these species that were research scale or R&D scale 5 or 10 years ago, somebody is producing successfully now, or they're producing a closely related species. So we're becoming more comfortable recommending so the red snapper, northern red snapper, Lechanis campechanus. Nobody's really producing that commercially right now, but we feel very comfortable recommending that to people because there are commercial farms doing related species, as well as people in academia who are really demonstrating the commercial feasibility of that, even though it hasn't been done on a large scale. So you have to do your research, but a lot of species we're more comfortable with. And then the biology aspect is really matching the species and the location. If you have a species that you're in love with, make sure you find the location that fits it. If you have a location that you're in love with, make sure you find the species that fits it. And once you get that match, you should be set up for success. There's a lot of details that you have to look into, but the biology often can be worked around in site selection and species selection, depending on sort of what side you're approaching it from. So those are the main concerns, but there's a lot of species that can work, a lot of species that are being produced already successfully, and it makes for a healthy and robust industry.
A lot of variables and a lot in terms of economics when making the species selection. Very interesting. We have quite a few more questions here. I don't think we're going to get to them all. I'm going to maybe close out with this one, which I think is quite good. What are some of the pathways forward or tools that can help further reduce uncertainty and increase investor confidence in open ocean aquaculture? And this delegate has this question in terms of the US in particular. And also building on that a little bit, where have been some of the success stories? You guys have worked on quite a few projects. Maybe we can close by talking about what can we do to improve confidence in this area of the market, and also maybe elaborate on some of those success stories.
So why don't we sort of all take a turn at answering it? So
I think that's great.
I'll take a stab at it and won't answer all of it. But I would see it, number one is the technology, the AI, the machine learning, and Tyler's the one out of the three of us who's most involved with that group. So I think he should speak to that. In terms of the US, to answer your question in terms of the US, we need a clear regulatory framework. It's going to be very difficult for investors to do 8, potentially 9-figure investments in an arena or a landscape with no roadmap. So Tyler mentioned the Aqua Act, the executive order. I think one of the biggest things that we as a country can do, in terms of food security and so forth, and generating a domestic industry, is to support that bipartisan effort for a regulatory framework. And then finally,
and you're talking about the U.S. Here, right?
Specifically the U.S. Yeah, I mean, some more, I would say, mature countries in terms of the industry, aquaculture. Look at Norway, Scotland, Canada, right, and so forth, Ireland. They have a regulatory framework. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's not easy to get that permit, but at least the odds going in, the homework assignments, the boxes you have to tick. So, my contribution to this question is, let's really put forth an effort to create a landscape that will allow investment into this industry. It's going to come. We've got 7 billion people. We got to feed 9 billion people by, in 20, 30 years. If it doesn't happen here, it's going to happen somewhere else. We're missing out on an opportunity. So I would really recommend that, of course, everybody's recommending it that's on this call, but, to get our ducks in a row on the regulatory path.
Gotcha. And Felipe, where are you on this?
Yeah, I mean, so this is more. This could be more than U.S. Statement, but government support, in particular, I'll give an example, is subsidies, right? We see subsidies going to a lot of different sectors of the seafood industry. If aquaculture is going to open ocean aquaculture, we need to be at that table and get a fair share of some of those subsidies, or at least be on par with those subsidies. When we go to the market, when open ocean produced fish goes to the market, it should be on a fair level playing ground, and not with subsidized costs that would favor a fishing industry or whatever, right? Not to call anyone out. So I think that is something that we need to really strive for, and hope that our government legislators and can really step in and offer a fair playing ground.
Tyler?
Langley and Felipe both make excellent points. Luckily, there's a lot to discuss on this topic. 2 points that I would bring up. The first one is it's a very new industry, like I've said, particularly in the United States. So you sort of have to operate within that reality. When you look at a more mature country or a more mature industry like the industry in Norway, when you hire somebody to work at your farm, you're hiring a real aquaculture technician or aquaculture manager or whatever the position is. You have a talent pool to hire from that's local. And that's limited in the United States, where there's some excellent schools, some excellent programs, and we need more of that. We need the human capital such that these new farms have a talent pool and they can pull out that mid-level manager that Langley was talking about, who is from that area and has experience dealing with that area. He has connections and he has experience in the industry. And a lot of that comes with time, and there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, but we can encourage that by promoting these academic programs, school programs, and making that more of a normal career path for people to take. The other side, and this is big in terms of making investors feel comfortable, is having data. And one of the big areas where we see that, or the lack of data, is in insurance products. And so this is another area where we talk to people all the time, and we feel that, you know, a submerged pen is safer than alternatives in that environment. And we talk to the underwriters, the insurance salespeople, and they say, give us the data and you got it. And that again takes time, and it's a chicken and the egg thing. Once we get the farms out there, the data comes in, we can demonstrate all these concepts that we believe in and that we're seeing in however many farms we're working with, but they require a lot of data to sort of demonstrate that financial risk or lack thereof, and can insure it properly. So the insurance products that are available for open ocean aquaculture are sort of a barometer for how much data we can show to an investor to say, this is an accurate assessment of risk, this is an accurate projection of how much capital you're going to put in, what your returns are going to be. All that stuff takes time to build, and we're borrowing that from other countries to sort of fill that gap in. But it would be great to have even 1 or 2, 3 or 4, maybe 10, dare to dream, operations in the United States, so we can point to them and say they've done it, this is what they're doing, we have data to support these claims, and that data is from a local or a domestic operation. So that would go a long way in getting both regulators and investors comfortable. And it's a chicken and the egg, so it's difficult, but it would go a long way.
Sure, and I suppose collaboration, right, with other industry stakeholders is a big part of that as well, right? And you know, hopefully events like this webinar and subsequent events can facilitate deeper, closer, expanded collaboration, cooperation amongst the stakeholders. Do you guys agree?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And an industry that I would point to is agriculture, which is very close to aquaculture. It's just a different set of animals in a different environment. And for that reason, the technology is very different. But we've seen a movement towards what's called precision agriculture, which a lot of people are familiar with. And that's using remotely sensed data from satellites and all these fine-tuned instruments, moisture sensors in the soil, and getting very highly instrumented and sort of data-rich contributions coming in to make your operation more precise. And that's the way aquaculture is going. And that's, like we were saying with the AI products, where you get those percentage points of efficiency that can really tilt your economic model to make it look from something that you might need an impact investor to get on board with, to something that your regular person who wants to make money, not an ocean person, pure investor. Suddenly this looks really attractive compared to investing in real estate, investing whatever other industry they're considering. We're getting to that point where the scales are tilting, and people feel really good and confident about the numbers.
Sure, well put. And I think that's a great place to stop. We have covered all the questions we can for today. But as we mentioned, if we didn't get your questions, someone from Innovasea will get in touch with you directly at some point in the days ahead. So with that, I'd like to thank all you guys and of course Innovasea for hosting this presentation. We really appreciate the insights.
Well, thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
And thanks for moderating.
Sure, and we'd also like to thank you, everybody out there in the audience, for joining us today. The webinar, The Economics of Ocean-Based Aquaculture, Dollars and Cents on the High Seas, which was presented by Innovasea in association with IntraFish. We really are grateful for your time and look forward to seeing you at an event like this next time. Have a great day, everybody.
Right, thanks.